Anyway, let's get into our main topic here, and that is your podcast is not worldwide. You might think it's worldwide, but it's not worldwide. And let's talk about that a little bit, because when you go to create your podcast, you think to yourself, "Oh yeah, I'm going to publish it on iTunes, and everybody's going to see it. I'm going to be popular in this country, and this country, and this country." And there's been times where I've seen my podcast get traction in another country, but the reality is, your podcast it doesn't always transfer over to another country. And the reason why I brought this topic up was because of the fact I had another person. I was answering somebody on another forum, and they were talking about copyrights and fair use. This is where it all stemmed from. Fair use is a United States rule. They basically said, hey, you can take clips of some audio and use it to tell a story, talk about certain things. Fair use is a very mixed and muddled thing. It's tough to use, but bottom line is, even with certain Creative Commons licenses, you own the content. So, like, for instance, if I took this audio and I said it's under this Creative Commons, no deriv, I think it's no, you can't use it commercially. So you can't just take this audio and then turn around and put the whole thing up on your show and make lots of money off of it. But it says that you can take my show or clips of my show and talk about it. So if I talk about this and you want to respond to that, you can add this and then go from there. But it's ultimately my decision, which means that if I watch or listen to your version of it and I don't like what's going on, I can say, no, you got to take that down. So fair use, and that's the whole line on fair use. Is it's so mixed up, muddled up, shook up world. It's just crazy. But you get the idea is that, sometimes, if you're creating a show, and I'd love to have somebody like Anthony from 10 Second Songs come on and talk about this a little bit, because there's ways to get around that. And it's like Weird Al Yankovic said, when he made parodies, he knew he didn't have to get the person's permission, but he'd always get that person's permission first. And if they did say no, or if they said no, take it down, he did take it down. You just have to play that game when it comes to fair use. But we're not talking about fair use. We're talking about podcast distribution across the world. Now, you might have seen somebody listen or watch your podcast on another country using podcasts. Now, we're not talking YouTube or anything like that, although this does pile in on the whole thing. And so you might have seen somebody consume your show from another country, and you think to yourself, "Oh wow, I'm global." I've seen it myself. I've had people in Guam watch my podcasts, listen to my podcasts. It's like, I'm international now. This is awesome. But that's not always the case. There's a lot of terms, there's a lot of conditions, and there's a lot of basically how your podcast can go. A good example, iTunes. Now, of course, iTunes going away. Now, podcast, it doesn't matter if it's iTunes or podcast app. They still have the same terms of service. And the terms of service that we sign in the United States saying that we're part of the United States, and we're gonna follow the rules that our country has about publishing content, and go from there. So you got that podcast, and let's say you are publishing with content. For some reason, it doesn't work in the UK. Here's a perfect example. John Oliver does a show called Last Week Tonight. During his show, he shows clips of the UK Parliament. Apparently, they can't show those clips in the UK. So he ends up replacing those clips with other clips. Kind of funny things like Gilbert Gottfried reading, I don't know, some public domain book or something like that, for that point in time that they can't show what they show in the United States. Same thing happens here. In the United States, you have your iTunes. iTunes has a license in the UK. iTunes has a license in other countries, but not always will your podcast move over to these other countries. So hopefully, I know it's kind of confusing a little bit, but the reality is that if you want your podcast to show up in some of these countries that don't automatically just move it over, you have to register for it. A perfect example, your podcast will not be seen in China. This podcast will not be seen in China unless I register into the podcast area on here. There's an interesting article. This is over on NeijingMarketingGroup.com. And basically it says, hey, can you put your podcast in China? And the answer is yes, but it's not easy. And we'll go down here. It shows what they're calling online radio, because it's not really podcasting to them. It's online radio, which and we've talked about this in weeks past. But here's some of the networks, I guess you could say, that are podcast apps that you can use. Like, for instance, Koala FM. First example here. Launched in 2013, China's most popular news app. The target is for people that think about online radio platforms. 40 to 55-year-olds. And registration. Here's the key right here. On Koala, users are only allowed to upload pre-recorded podcasts, no live content. For individuals, you will need to submit a Chinese ID card, info, or a passport if you're not a Chinese citizen. An account is free. So I can use my passport, or a Chinese ID card, which I don't have, of course. So for companies, soft companies, Chinese business license, and judicial representative. So what I would have to do is I would have to hire somebody to list my podcast into this network to get into a Chinese network. Now, there's other ones. This one, Lazy FM, their registration says all you need is a Chinese phone number and you'll be sent a verification SMS. An account is free. There's different qualifications on these podcast apps that they use in China, because they don't use iTunes in China. And so you get the idea is that you might even be creating a Chinese podcast that's going to be completely friendly, doesn't talk politics or anything like that, because those podcasts get banned in China as well. But, you could have a really China-friendly podcast that you want to publish in China, and you have to go through these steps to do that. So your podcast doesn't always transfer over. And the same thing, in a few weeks, I'm going to South Korea. South Korea is known for podcasting. They love podcasts. They love to listen to podcasts. So how do you get into that market with your show? Because they do listen to English-speaking podcasts. What needs to happen back and forth? Now, the other thing is, can I listen to my podcasts while I'm in South Korea? And that answer is also no, because of, it's no different than a TV show. I can't watch Storage Wars Canada unless it gets broadcast on an American channel or something like that. Same thing, there's always been that issue of who can see something. Like, for instance, any type of pay-per-view, they've got to get licensing not only for the United States, but Canada, for all the countries, because all these countries have different rules. And things like fair use is one of those rules that if they don't agree to, then they have a hard time bringing that podcast in. There's going to be headbutting, and you just gotta do what you do and work on licensing in other countries for your podcast. Now, is your podcast worth going to other countries? for the 706,000 podcasts out there and the percentage that still do podcast, the answer is probably no. I don't know. Maybe your podcast is about working with programs that are only in the United States. They're not going to care about it in China or South Korea or India or anything anywhere else, unless they have a reason to care about it. So probably an answer is no. But if you do want to take your podcast, like for instance this show, there's people podcasting in South Korea. I want to show them how to podcast in South Korea. They'll show me how to podcast in South Korea. I don't know. But the bottom line is that they'll be able, once I have that connection, once they know I have a show and they respond to the show, we can set up a communication, go from there. So maybe it's worth it for this show to be in South Korea. Maybe this show is worth it to be in China. That takes a little bit more than just publishing an iTunes feed, an RSS feed. Now, you can get your podcasts from other countries in other countries using things like VPNs, which we won't get into because there's also legalities in that. It's the same way, if you're trying to watch your Hulu or your Netflix while you're outside the country, you VPN into a country, into the United States, and then you watch it from there, and which is nice. But like I said, gets into legalities on that. So you can definitely pull your podcasts and continue to consume what you need to consume. But it's not always going to work the way that you want it. So if you're heading out of the country, remember that's one of the things you want to research yourself is how do I continue to get my podcasts while I'm out of the country? And then if you want to podcast and put your podcast in another country, you got to find out the rules for that. Now, I did a lot of searching on the internet. It's tough to find what the rules are for the individual country. Will my podcast show up in India? Will my podcast show up in South Korea? Will my podcast show up in wherever else? A lot of them, they will. I was in Spain. I could get to my website. I could get to my shows. I was in Tel Aviv, Israel, and I could get to my website. I could get to the content. And ultimately, if they can get to your website, 90% of the time, they can download the content from the website and listen that way, consume that way. But if you're connected with YouTube, if you're connected with Spotify, if you're connected with iTunes, Google, as far as I know, Google only is in the United States and Canada. iTunes has reach outside the United States, but not as far as you think. And those are things to put in consideration if you really want to expand your show, is how do people consume it in other countries? I have friends that live in other countries that sat there and go, I really wanted to watch this show, but I could only watch the United States. So either I had to wait to get to the United States to watch the show, or I had to do something that wasn't legal to consume that content. And that's what people do. They're basically, if they're consuming your content in another country and you don't have it registered in there, they are they're obtaining it illegally. I know it sounds weird, doesn't it? But it is. That's very true. That's how it works. You want to be legal in all countries. Let's say you have a worldwide podcast. You want to show everybody how that works. You want everybody to consume it, and in order to do that, sometimes you need to basically find somebody that can help you put your podcast in that country, especially a place like China, because that's tougher when it comes to podcasting. Like I said, they don't call it podcasts. They call it radio TV or something. Or no, not radio TV. Radio. That was stupid. Yeah, the radio FM. Yeah. So that's big key right there. So, but the real question is, do you focus on having your podcast outside of the United States. Maybe you're outside of the United States and you want the U.S. population to consume that podcast. What do you do to bring the podcast in? Because the same rules apply here. And one other thing I do need to mention, and that going back to the fair use, if you're in the podcast store in the United States, you're falling under the rules of the podcast store in the United States. And there's ways around it. I'll give you an example here. A few years ago, there were a whole bunch of gambling websites that just popped up. And the reason why they could function was because they were not based in the United States. They were based in, wherever they could do gambling legally. So basically, if you placed a bet, you didn't place a bet in the United States, you placed a bet in another country, and then they paid you. And so there was a little bit of question on the legality on that. Eventually, a lot of those websites were taken down in the United States. They could probably still be used in other countries, but they were taken down in the United States, which probably ultimately ruined their use, and then they went down anyway. But the idea is that, they skirted it by going to another country. You're listening to iTunes in the United States. You're following the rules of their terms of service, which are based off of the rules that the country has and each individual state has about whatever. And of course, fair use is a part of the United States rules, and therefore fair use will get applied within your podcast. If you move that outside the country, technically, if they're getting it through iTunes, they still have to follow the U.S. rules. But it's easy, a country can say, no, this website, it doesn't follow what we deem as appropriate, and therefore you get shut down. So hopefully that answers a little bit of question on that, because it's a big, a lot of people think, I publish a podcast, you'll be able to get it on Mars if there's somebody out there trying to catch a podcast. No, that's not always the case. Even though you put your content out there, you still have to take steps to take that content to other places, especially if you need people in China to consume your podcast.